And now we shift gears, as I said we would, hopefully not stripping them, to Kenneth White, a history major, and he's also relating his senior thesis on the Germanization of the late Roman Empire.
Hello. All right. Oh. There we go. Yeah. Oh yeah. You can do whatever. All right. Sorry, I'm a little nervous. Hi everyone. I'm Kenny. I did my thesis on the Germanization of the late Roman Empire, and so I was focusing on basically the Roman Empire between about 400 AD and 476 AD. Read about the collapse, and this here was the Roman Empire in 400. You can see the split between the Eastern Empire is in blue and the Western Empire is in red. It's still at really at the height of its power, control-wise, and the people or the area I'm going to be talking about is largely here around what we would now know today as Germany. They would have called it Germania. They wouldn't necessarily have referred to the people as Germans, but by the individual tribes. But I'll be referring to them as Germans because that's what we do now. So I'm largely talking about the people right up here and their influence on the Roman Empire. So the question is, what areas of the Roman Empire saw influence by the Germanic tribes? And the answer is pretty simple: everywhere. They influence Roman politics, they influence Roman military, they influence everyday, just your average Roman citizen, and they had large-scale settlements within the Roman Empire. So basically, from 400 on, you would have seen a Germanic person any day that you're walking around within the Roman Empire. So I'll start with the political aspects. And the main area within the political part of the Roman Empire that you're going to see Germanic influence is the consulship. This is the really easy area to see it. So prior to the creation of the empire, the consulship would have been the highest political position that someone could achieve within the empire. These men ran the Senate. There was 2 of them. They were elected for a year, and they basically would have been the equivalent of like the president today. So they were the elected officials at the top of the republic. But when we have the creation of the empire, we now have an emperor. There's really no need to have these consuls leading over the Senate because now the emperor leads over the empire. But the consulship still stays. And instead what we see is the consulship becomes a political honor that can be bestowed. And so you still have your yearly consuls, but the emperor picks someone to bestow this honor of consulship upon. And so I have a quote here from Samuel Dill. He's a Roman historian, and he stated that when an office, which the emperor himself was proud to hold, was given so freely to men of barbarian origin, it is plain that the old exclusiveness had disappeared and that the Germans had stolen their way into the very citadel of the empire long before its distant outworks were stormed. It became very common in the later part of the empire that Romans would give this highest political honor to people of Germanic descent. One of the best examples that we have of this is the Emperor Theodosius. In 3 consecutive years, he gave the consulship to Murabades, Reichimer, and Boeto. None of these names sound very Latin because they're all men of Germanic descent. So here he is 3 consecutive years giving the highest political honor within the empire to Germans. Alright, so the military influence that we see. This largely is in the form of the weapons that were used. The Roman Republic had built its dominance of the Mediterranean world through the use of the gladius and the spatha. The gladius was a Roman short sword. It was adopted originally from the Spanish, but the Romans had adopted at the very beginning of the Republic, so it basically became known as a Roman sword. It was the weapon that the Romans used. And the pilum, which is the one in the middle there, it's a spear that was thrown. Towards the end of the empire, though, we see a change. they no longer used the gladius and the the pilum. Instead, they used the spatha. This was a Germanic sword. It was longer than the gladius, and the reason for this was that they found themselves coming into conflict more with cavalry. You find yourselves fighting the Huns, the Vandals. Both of these, as well as others like the Goths, are going to be very mobile tribes, and thus they come from the East Asian steppes, and they tend to ride horses, and so you need a longer sword. Problem is when you're coming into conflict with infantry, a longer weapon's a lot harder to use in infantry conflict. So the Romans' ability to fight infantry decreases, even if they are better at cavalry. As well as the spatha would have, Germans knew how to use the spatha. They were raised using the spatha. So when we see the flood of Germans within the military ranks themselves, they know how to use these weapons. And we can see here, the spatha is the one up here on the top, and the gladius that the Romans would have used is down here. Sometimes as much as almost a quarter of a length larger than the gladius. Another area in the military that we see influence is in the use of the strategies that they used. Towards the end, they also adopted Germanic strategies. As well as we see it go the other way, in which we see Germans adopting Roman strategies. And one of the best examples that you can see that is in the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. This is a very famous battle in which Varus was destroyed by the Germans and he lost many Roman legions. The man who defeated him, the German, was Arminius. He was actually trained by the Romans in strategy. So he went to Rome, fought with Rome, they trained him to be an officer, then he went back to Germania and used these tactics that he learned against the Romans. So we have this give and go of techniques in which the Germans are learning Roman techniques and the Romans are taking German techniques. We also see a change in fashion, believe it or not. So the Emperor Honorius, he actually banned the wearing of Germanic clothing within the city of Rome. And the reason for this is that people they were wearing trousers, long hair, and fur coats were like the big thing of the day, which was very Germanic dress. And this is starting to make it seem like, are we Rome or are we German? Like, we're dressing like them, we're acting like them. And so he actually banned this and made it so if you're in the city of Rome, you have to wear like standard Roman togas, just the standard Roman clothing, rather than the Germanic fashion that had been adopted. All right, marriage. So we see this law against Germans and Romans marrying, which is how it's been interpreted for a very, very long time. In reality, when you look at it, it looks like it should be interpreted differently. The law states, the imperators Valentian and Valens, Augustus's to Theodosius, master of horse. For none of the provincials of any rank or status may there be a marriage with a barbarian wife, nor many provincial women marry any of the Gentiles. But if any relation by marriage between provincials and Gentiles arises because of marriages of this sort, that which is detected to be suspect or distasteful in them shall be punished capitally. This seems very clear, cut, and dry. All right, provincials can't marry Germans, Gentiles, you can't have the marriage of Gentiles and Romans. But you see at this time a high level of Romans and Germans intermarrying. You see this at the highest level when Bueto, the consul that I mentioned earlier, his daughter became Empress Eudoxia when she married the Emperor Arcadius. So you have a German's daughter marrying the Roman Empire, or emperor. And so clearly at the highest level, we see these marriages happening. And if it's happening there, it's happening at a higher level down at your regular people that just wouldn't have been documented as much. So we have to get at what are provincials and what are Gentiles. Provincial men are men that don't have full citizenship. As a result of this, a marriage between them and a Germanic woman would have resulted in a child with a confusing situation of citizenship. This part of the law preventing the marriage of provincials and Germans isn't necessarily something against Germans and Romans marrying. It's dealing with citizenship. If they have a child, where is this child going to fit into? What type of citizenship do we get them? What type of laws do they get protected by? And so it was just easier to be like, all right, they shouldn't marry because we're not going to know what to do with their kids. The second one to deal with, the Gentiles. As another Roman historian, Ralph Matheson, states, the Gentiles were barbarians who were living in communities of military Gentiles under the authority of the master of arms. This law isn't preventing Romans and Germans from marrying once again, but instead it was stating that the Gentiles, they were Germans fighting for Rome. They had to finish their military duty. If you have these German soldiers coming into Rome to fight for Rome, and then they start marrying Roman wives, they're going to want to go and deal with their new marriage rather than fight for Rome. So it was all about keeping them in the military community to fight for Rome, rather than going into civilian life. Once they finished their duties, more than likely they would have been allowed to go and marry a Roman woman. Germanic settlements. This is probably the more well-known part of the Germanization of the empire, because we see massive amounts of Germans living within the empire. We have good examples and bad examples. The first bad example is the Visigoths. So basically, the Visigoths, they were getting pressure put on them by the Huns. And so they decided, all right, we want to live in the Roman Empire because you'll protect us from the Huns, because they've got Rome on one side and the Huns on the other side. And so they petition to go live within the empire, and the Emperor Valens accepts this petition. And he's figuring, okay, the Visigothic nation living within the Roman Empire, that's a lot of soldiers to fight for me. Works out for like a year or two. And in 378, there's an uprising within the empire. The Visigoths have a great victory against the empire, and 4 years later, so there's 4 years of fighting, and in 382, they're allowed to peacefully resettle within the empire. It's here that Valens finally thought that he would receive what he was looking for in soldiers to fight for him, this military service. And in 388 and 394, we see that the Gothic people campaign as auxiliaries for the Roman legions. The problem here, though, is that they suffer massive casualties, because obviously the Roman generals are going to be more likely to send the German soldiers in first, because German soldiers die killing German soldiers, then it's a win-win for the Roman Empire. And so the Visigoths don't really like this. And so in 395, we see another rebellion. This one, though, they now have a very capable leader. They have Alaric the Great is leading this rebellion. He's also a very well-known figure towards the end of the Roman Empire. And his rebellion goes on for 20 or so years. And in 410, this is where we see the sacking of Rome. So this idea of bringing the Visigoths within the empire ends in the sack of Rome in 410. As well as you have other places like Rome. Italy, their economy was just destroyed for years. They reduced taxes in Italy, and they still, for 10, 15, 20 years after the Alaric's just running through Italy, they still couldn't pay these reduced taxes. That's how much he just devastated the economy of Italy. We have some good examples. We have the Ostrogoths. These people entered the Roman Empire after the fall of the Hunnic Empire, which they had been living within in 454. Basically, the Hunnic Empire fell, and they're like, all right, we need somewhere else to live, so they went to Rome. They went to the province of Pannonia, and the historian Lynn White described the relationship of the Ostrogoths living in Italy as Ostrogoths in Italy imagined themselves Romans, striving to keep out those they called barbarians who were in fact their cousins. They saw themselves as Romans, they fought for Rome, and this is what the Romans were looking for. We have the Burundians, who are also a similar example. They were allocated lands near the Rhineland, which would have been right on like the border of France, Germany. This agreement proved to be much more successful than the Visigoths. The Burundians happily relocated into the Roman Empire and even considered themselves to be descendants of Rome. They never rebelled against the Roman government. Instead, they helped to fight against the barbarians who, just like the Ostrogoths, would have been their cousins. All right, so this is a map of the Roman Empire, and you can see all of these colored names are all Germanic tribes living within the empire. So we still would have had the empire with the borders as we saw in the initial map at the beginning, but you got the Burgundians living within the empire, the Franks, the West Goths, which would have been the Visigoths, and the East Goths, which would have been more of the Ostrogoths, which would have been around here, the Visigoths more around there. You've got all sorts of Goths up in Italy, but you've got all these Germans living within the Roman Empire. So what does all this mean? What does their political influence, their military influence, the Germanic settlements within the empire, what does all of this mean? And this is really what I kind of came to when I finished writing my thesis with all this information, was this idea of the passing of the torch. A lot of times when we see and hear about the fall of the Roman Empire, you think about just massive Germanic invasions and just violence and death. And while there would have been a lot of this, it appears more of like a passing of the reins. You see that the Germanic and the barbarian tribes are living within there, and when the Roman Empire sort of moves on, they kind of already had prepared the Germanic tribes of how to run Europe. Even when we see the final collapse of the Roman Empire, you have Orestes, a general within Rome, who was a German, fighting against Odoacer, who's the supreme commander of the Roman military, who was of Hunnic descent, and his son, Romulus Augustus, the last Roman Empire, would have also been of the same descent as his father Orestes. So you even have all the civil wars that happen are people of Germanic and barbarian descent fighting each other within the Roman Empire. And so you just have this passing of the torch of, by the time of the final fall in 476, there's so many Germans that they're the ones really pulling the shots within the empire. And so we have here, 453 would have been, right about 20 or so years before the final collapse, and 526 would have been about 50 years after. And I found this to be really interesting because you have the Suevi people here, you have the Suevi people here. You have the Visigoths here, and the Visigoths would have been here in Spain. The Franks here, the Franks here in France. The Burundians here, the Burundians, same spot. The Ostrogoths would have been the East Kingdom, the Ostrogoths there. You have all of these tribes where they were living within Rome, and now they're living in the same place just on their own. So it's almost like when the Roman Empire and the government finally didn't have the means to control this vast area of land, the government just kind of faded away, and instead now you have the Germanic kingdoms that were already living within the empire come up and just organize and govern themselves rather than being governed by Rome. So that's my presentation.
Questions or comments for Kenny?
I was just wondering, how are the Germans so different from the Spanish, for example, the North Africans? I mean, after the Napoleon Empire, a lot of the emperors themselves, I mean, Hadrian and Trajan and Spain, possibly Septimius Severus and his wife Juliana came from North Africa. How were the Germans so different than the Spaniards in terms of what they did for the Turkish power?
The Germans and the Spaniards would have been a little bit of difference because of how long they had been within the empire. You see Spain and North Africa are occupied by Rome during the wars with Carthage in about 200, it's 250 BC through 150 BC. And so by the time of the period we're talking about, 480, these areas like Spain and North Africa have been part of the Roman Empire for 500 years or so. And especially with Rome, when you fulfilled your military service in Rome, oftentimes you were given land. The area that Roman citizens had been given land would have been in Spain, North Africa. So a lot of the people living within those areas are actually descendants of Italians that were put into those areas as a reward for their military service. So those people would have been able to more likely connect their descendancy to Italians, unlike the Germans, who never actually fully got occupied by Rome. Rome tried many times, and militarily, like we saw in Teutoburg Forest, they were stopped by the Germanics time and again. And so most likely what I would say the difference is that the Spanish North Africans are much more assimilated from hundreds and hundreds of years into Roman culture, that they've had intermarrying, that they can track their descendancy to Romans. Most of these Germans would not have been able to track any descendancy to Romans.
So would you say that it just happened that there were just too many Germans and too many places to assimilate them?
Yeah, I mean,
like the mix got off. I mean, it was
yeah.
the Spaniards, it's like they got integrated into the Roman Empire, which remained the Roman culture, but with the Germans, they sort of impacted the balance of cultural power.
The Germans were much less willing to give up their own culture. I mean, even when we look at a lot of the Germanic tribes living within, and I talk about this more in my thesis, you have them all, the Spanish adopted Roman names, they adopted Roman, they spoke Latin. The Germans, those living within the empire, they often still kept their Germanic names. They still, I know specifically in France, they would have still spoke the Gallic language. And so you still have their holding on to their Germanic roots rather than the other ones who had been there for so long, they were more willing to take on Roman identity.
One quick last question.
I wouldn't say this is the first time this comparison's been drawn, but I was noticing a lot of comparisons between our own country and the Roman Empire, because you have a Roman Empire which is influenced by Hellenization, Greek influence, and then you have our country which in some parts influenced by English. And then as our country goes on, we accept all these foreign immigrants in the same way that Rome swallows all these other nations up. And in the same way that Rome accepts all the gods, the cultures of the nations conquered into their own, we accept the cultures, the languages, etc. from our own nations. And I was kind of drawing a comparison between like how Japanese internment, how we were trying to like stifle these people that were willing to fight for us for saying we're American citizens in the same way that they were stifling Germans. So I was wondering, in what ways are we capable of like potentially, like I was like kind of looking at this and saying, was it a fault of the Roman Empire for not bringing these German citizens and accepting them fully, leading into their fall, or was it potentially not recognizing enough of a fear of these immigrants, of these German people?
Yeah, I actually wrote a thesis in high school comparing Rome in the U.S. today, so I do have a little bit of research that I've done on that. Not so much as far as the immigrant situation, I'm not exactly sure of. Because of the fact that the U.S. is definitely more accepting of immigrants than Rome necessarily would have been of the Germans. I know the Germans just had a very negative idea, or the Romans, they were very threatened by them. But you see all sorts of other areas, like sexual immorality becomes huge at the end of the Roman Empire, and you see that a lot in the U.S. today. You see economical comparisons between them, and also you can look at things like the acceptance of immigrants. There are a very lot of comparisons between the two that can be kind of troubling at times.
Thank you, Kenny.